Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this webinar that is presented in conjunction with Wyoming Manufacturing Works. The subject matter today is your supply chain dangerously leaked? This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is being presented by Firestorm. Keep in mind that this presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product provided by Firestorm should be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or a legal opinion. Today, our presenters are Jennifer Freedman and Guy Higgins of Firestorm. Amanda Hansen is the Manufacturing Works coordinator for this webinar. Guy's background is as a U.S. naval officer and then in aerospace with the Boeing organization. He's in what he calls his third career with Firestorm. Jennifer's background is marketing, communication, strategy development, and she helps companies devise interesting and robust business continuity strategies. Amanda is the Southeast Wyoming Business Engineering Consultant for Manufacturing Works. She has excellent expertise she likes to bring resources like Firestorm to Wyoming businesses. Amanda, we'll give it to you for a minute so that you can discuss what Manufacturing Works does.
Well, thank you, Bill. Manufacturing Works, we are the Manufacturing Extension Partnership for Wyoming, so we are pleased to work with manufacturers as well as other businesses here in Wyoming to help them in a variety of ways. We have engineering solutions from engineers like me. We have business growth solutions from experts in those areas, everything from exporting to coming up with the next great product. Efficiency, energy, and environmental, whether that's streamlining a process that you have or making sure that your impact on the environment is minimized, we can help with that. We also have experts in leadership and other business management aspects who can help, especially smaller companies that are figuring out how to manage through change. We also have a CFO for hire. And now we are pleased to be adding business resilience solutions with the expertise of Guy and Jennifer.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. A little bit about Firestorm. We like to talk in Firestorm about being focused on business continuity and resilience. We like to tell people that it's all that we do, but we do it all. From the analyzing and assessing your situation to understanding what plans need to be developed, to developing those plans, implementing them, practicing them, training on them, and conducting exercises so that you can have any or all of the help that you need to manage risk and crisis. Before we get started, I want to take a standard look here at what's going on in the world today. So just a quick update. The repercussions of the hacking into the Sony database and the release of a lot of internal Sony emails and proprietary information, that those repercussions are still echoing and resonating throughout the world. And in fact, it's certainly become an international object of interest and will continue to be that way for quite some time. That's important because if that can happen to a company with the resources and the focus of Sony, then it can happen to anybody. And we just saw earlier this week that the U.S. Central Command's Twitter account was hacked into. That was the Twitter account that was hacked into, not the U.S. Central Command. But once again, it represents the risk and the vulnerability that anybody can have in the internet-connected world. Earlier this year, AirAsia lost an airplane, and that was a terrible, terrible tragedy for the passengers and the crew of that airplane and their families. But we want to point out that in this particular case, AirAsia has done a remarkably good job in handling the aftermath of that crash. Unlike Malaysia Air back in March, There was no attempt to control information. They came out with information as soon as they had it. The CEO, Tony Fernandez, has been vocal on Twitter and in visiting the families and talking with the families of the people who were killed in the crash. They have handled it very well. It doesn't mean that AirAsia is going to escape scot-free from this kind of a problem, but that they are doing a much better job than it was done early last year by Malaysia Air. Everybody's out there celebrating the reduction in gas prices and the decline in energy prices, and there's a good side to that, that we're making, that we're seeing more money both in our individual bank accounts and in our corporate accounts as we're paying less for energy. The bad side about that is that that is depressing some of the businesses, and particularly in places like Wyoming. We're seeing less money coming into a lot of the new exploration areas because the current price for oil and gas is down to the point where some of the fields aren't worth continued exploration. So there's a good and a bad side to that, and certainly in a state like Wyoming, that's felt very acutely. The good news here on this next bullet is that Wyoming was recently identified as the 5th best state in the country for small businesses, and that was based on a number of different things, including taxes and the overall environment. That's from the National Federation of Independent Businesses, so that's good news, and it should make everybody feel a little bit better that you're not in New York State, which was the last on the list. They came in around 50th.
Around?
Yes, a nice round number, 50th. Cold weather is obviously blanketing the country. And I'm mentioning that specifically because that can have a huge impact on you, and it can have a huge impact on your suppliers. Last week there was a massive pileup on one of the interstates up in the northern Midwest, and multiple semis were caught in a crash. There was fire. It was a serious, serious accident, and if your vendor was delivering your product on one of those semis, you had an impact. And that was a cold weather caused crash. So it's important to recognize that anything can hit you. Now, more good news. There's expectations that reshoring, manufacturing that has been sent out of the country is going to be coming back. More of it coming back in 2015 than was in 2014. That's good news because it's opportunity for companies to increase their business. The next two are along the lines of communicable illnesses. Flu is now reported as epidemic in 40 out of the 50 states, and 28 children are dead. We tend to think of flu as something that you catch and you get over in a week or so. But point of fact is, flu is an incredibly dangerous disease. And if I had said that 28 people died from Ebola, the country would be up in arms. And we don't pay that much attention to flu, even though the risk is much, much higher of contracting the flu than it is of contracting Ebola. And while the flu is not as lethal as Ebola, it is still a lethal disease. And the current flu shot is not effective as flu shots have been in past years. It's good for only about, Jennifer, a third of the viruses?
Yeah, a third.
About a third of the viruses are covered by that. So it's important to recognize that the flu can be an impact on you and your company and your suppliers if you lose significant numbers of your workforce. Recently, measles was linked to an outbreak in Disneyland. Certainly that's bad news for Disney, but when you look a little bit deeper, measles is now epidemic in 8 states. And that's really unfortunate. Measles is a disease that should be extraordinarily rare in the United States, and it's not. It's making a comeback, as you can see by the epidemic number, and that can have an impact on you and your vendors because it can once again reduce the workforce as people take advantage of legislation that allows them to take care of sick family members. So it's important to look at that. The bottom line, any world event can break a supply chain if that supply chain is too lean. And we're obviously going to talk about that today. So I want to start with a little bit of a retrospective. We tend to think of lean as being something that is one of the latest initiatives in manufacturing. But in fact, initiatives to become more productive and more lean reach back 1,000 years to interchangeable parts that were originally, at least as far as we can tell, developed in China in about 1050. Then there was a bit of a pause for the next 840 years until Frederick Taylor introduced something called scientific management, where he measured things and looked at a disciplined approach to reducing the amount of labor required to accomplish a goal. Then about 35 years later, that was developed into statistical process control, where a process was looked at, measured, statistical bounds established, and that was imposed to be able to monitor and understand whether a process was producing the way it should and where it could be improved. That led us about 20 years, 18 years later into process management, which was a huge initiative that allowed us, the United States, to become the arsenal of democracy in World War II, where we could develop parts from all over the country and know that they would in fact assemble properly when they were brought to a top-level equipment manufacturer. Following World War II, lean production started to really catch fire, and it caught fire, interestingly enough, in Japan more so than it did in the U.S. And of course, Toyota has become an icon of lean production, and that has propagated throughout the world. Now today, we're looking at lean supply chains, lean product development, not just production, but product development, how to lean out that new product development, and then how to lean out management, how to make our management more effective, more lean, more productive, instead of just bigger. Okay, so now let's look where that's taking us to in the future. So with that, we're looking at how lean has and is propagating throughout the entire global supply chain. Companies everywhere, on every continent, in almost every nation, throughout the supply chain. So it's in raw materials, and certainly in Wyoming with energy production, coal, oil, gas, a lot of the manufacturing, you're seeing it locally, but it's happening every place else too. Raw materials, manufacturing, it's happening in transportation, and it's happening in distribution. And I want to just take a second here to give you an example in transportation. Internationally, about 95% of all material that is moved internationally, between continents, is done by ships. And we human beings have been in the shipping business for about 4,500 years. So we've been doing that a long time. Today, when something is put on a ship in Asia and sent to the U.S., that ship plans a route that is every bit as sophisticated as the route that is planned by an airliner. It takes into account weather, it takes into account ocean conditions, it takes into account currents, it takes into account all sorts of things that are going on so that that ship can transit at as fuel efficient a route and spend as little money as is possible. Those routes are planned to such a degree of detail that each individual ship's hull form, hull type, and propulsion are considered when they plan the route. And it's that level of detail. Every single ship is in a database that allows that kind of planning to be done to reduce cost and eliminate waste. And it's important to recognize that that's how pervasive lean has become. And that's a really good thing because it helps everybody in the world to do that. And competition is forcing us to continue to emphasize lean everywhere. And like I said, lean is a good thing. So now let's just look at some of the facts as a little bit of background here before we start to get into the details of how to avoid problems with a lean supply chain. Every company has a supply chain. Every single company. I think probably the last company that didn't have a supply chain was when Henry Ford did everything himself, from owning the mines to owning the smelters to delivering and selling the cars. But today every company has it. Even if your supply chain is just Office Depot or Staples, you have a supply chain. When we start to look at original equipment manufacturers, 85% of the content, and this is on an average basis, 85% of the content of that final product is not produced by the OEM. It's produced by members of the supply chain of the supply network. And big OEMs General Motors, Boeing, General Electric, their supply chains can be more than 7 tiers deep. So they have suppliers who have suppliers who have suppliers, etc. It's like the elephant standing on the elephants holding up the world, right? It goes on forever. That can result in very limited visibility beyond that first or second tier. And if you look at that graphic there, you can see that your company might have 3 vendors. Well, those 3 vendors have 6 vendors, but down at the third tier, those 6 vendors might only have 5 vendors, and 2 of those 5 vendors are supporting a substantial number of your 6 second-tier vendors. That can be an issue. That can be a real bottleneck and can put you at risk. You can see there that vendor E down at the third tier is supporting both vendors 5 and 6 who are supporting vendor 3, and vendor 3 is at risk if vendor E suffers a problem. So it's important to have that kind of visibility into your supply chain. So what can go wrong? There are 70,000 natural disasters a year in the U.S. alone. And we've included a picture here of a hurricane. Not because in Wyoming we expect you to have problems with, we don't expect you to experience a hurricane in Wyoming. We think that you might think about, am I going to have a problem because of a hurricane? Because if you have a vendor in North Carolina or the Texas Gulf Coast or Florida or even in New York or Maine, you might have a problem caused by a hurricane if your vendor has a problem caused by a hurricane. So it's important to recognize how broadly this goes. In 2012, there was a study done that assessed the cost of disruptions to supply chains at $350 billion a year. And that cost of disruption is increasing, and the number of disruptions are increasing. And it turns out that when you start pulling those numbers apart, those disruptions are increasing not because the world's getting to be a more violent place, but because more and more companies, factories, producers are being located in cities, on coastlines, and coastlines tend to be surprisingly dangerous places because of hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis, earthquakes, etc. On infinitum. So it's important to recognize that. Then also in 2012, it was a supply chain survey concluded that those disruptions not only cost that $350 billion in disruption costs, but also resulted in an average 40% reduction or loss in both return on assets and return on sales. Those are serious impacts. Those are not impacts that companies are prepared to simply absorb. And that's why we want to talk about looking at your supply chain and being prepared to deal with it in such a way that you don't get disrupted.
Guy, I'm going to interrupt for just a minute because it occurs to me, we always get so excited about jumping into these webinars that we forget to mention that if anybody on the webinar has questions, you can ask your question using the panel on the side of your screen. And we have planned to have time to take questions at the end of this webinar, so please do ask your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to assure you that Jennifer will answer any of your questions. So with all of that, oh my goodness, scare the pants off of you background, what do your customers expect? And what's going to make them trust you? Well, customers are pretty simple. It's what I expect, what you expect. I expect what I ordered. I expect it when you said or we said we'd deliver it. And I expect to pay the cost that we agreed to, and I expect to get the quality that we agreed to. Really simple. What I want, when I wanted it, and at the price and quality we agreed to. So if you or your supply chain deliver that, then you're building trust. And the longer you deliver those things, the more trust that you deliver. What we want to do is to be able to build that trust in spite of a disruption, so that if your vendors or you as someone else's supply chain can react quickly, then you build that trust. And you can also communicate your plan to deliver in the event of a disruption. So I have a plan. Here's my plan. If we have problems, these problems, here's what we're going to do so that we can, Mr. Customer, deliver to you what you ordered, when you ordered it, at the cost and quality that we agreed to. And when we can do that, all of us, then our customers being human beings, tend to reward us because we have earned their trust and we have shown them that we're prepared to, and in the event of a disruption, can and have delivered in the face of a disruption. So, small break. I want to talk a little bit about suppliers here and how we can break them apart into different kinds of categories. So just looking at sources, we can have a sole source supplier. That's where I have chosen company A to be my supplier of widgets. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the sole source. That's where there is only company A supplies widgets. They're the only widget maker in the world. Okay, and so that's who we go to, every one of us. Okay, everybody who needs widgets. A single source, that's where there are actually multiple sources out there, but I have chosen for strategic reasons, or maybe not strategic reasons, to go to one company to do that. And that's an intentional decision, and that's fine, but it needs to be made in an informed manner. And then there's multiple sources. There are multiple companies out there that are producing a supply or a component or a raw material that I need, and I have elected to go to 2 or more of them to provide me with capability, with sources. So those are the different sources that we can have. Now, something that Jennifer and I have called obtainability, because we couldn't think of a better word to use for it. We can have custom supplies, or we can have commodity supplies. And a custom supply is where you have gone to a vendor and defined through specifications and agreements exactly what it is that they're going to deliver, and you're the only customer for that particular thing. It may be a minor modification, or it may be a completely different design from anything else they're producing. They're doing that for you. And a commodity is a commodity. Obviously, there can be shades of gray between the two, but we've looked at that as being a way to help us segment the supply chain. And your supplies can be critical, meaning you can't operate without them, or they can be non-critical, which means although it has an impact on your production, you have an ability to deal with it and to handle it, and it will not shut you down. So, Jennifer?
And the reason that we talk about segmenting the supply chain is when we, in a little bit, we'll start talking about assessing risk. As you assess risk, it's important to segment your supply chain into those sources that may have more risk and those sources that don't have as much risk, and that will help you move forward as you plan for a more resilient supply chain.
Okay. So if we take a look at those categories, that segmentation, and put it into this graphic, you can see with commodity, custom, non-critical, critical, and the various sources that there are the green, yellow, red kinds of risks. Now, if I was a really good online graphics artist, I'd be able to rotate that cube, but I guarantee you that I am not. So the non-critical single source and non-critical sole source that you can't see, the single source is yellow and the sole source non-critical is red, because even if it's non-critical, the only person you're buying it from is one company, he's the only producer in the world, then you have a risk there, and it's important to recognize that. Now, commodities can still provide a risk because there are things like lithium and titanium that are commodity, generally thought of as commodities, but the production, the global production of those commodities is already under contract for months or years into the future, and there is no, practically speaking, no flexibility in that supply chain. It's important to consider that as you plan for your supply chain and how to make that supply chain as lean yet productive and resilient as possible. So let's look at activity, risk, and responsibility. When we talk about lean, we say eliminate waste. And it's important now to recognize that, because too often people mentally translate eliminate waste into eliminate cost. And while all waste is a cost, not all cost is a waste. And so it's very important to eliminate waste and to understand where that waste is. And of course, Manufacturing Works, one of the things they help companies in Wyoming do is to look at and understand how to identify waste and how to eliminate it. So it's important to do that and understand lean very deeply and to implement it properly. Obviously, one of the things you can do to eliminate waste is you can take effort, components, parts that your company is not a core capability in developing or producing, and you can outsource that to a vendor whose job it is, who focuses on that and is very good and efficient and productive at it. So you can eliminate waste by taking something you don't do very well and outsourcing it to somebody who does it really well, much better than you do. Now, that activity, that manufacturing, that component, that subsystem, you can outsource that to eliminate waste, but it's really important to recognize that if the company, if the supplier you outsource to fails, okay, that risk of failure can't be outsourced because your customer doesn't care if your supplier had a failure. They're going to look to you. Your responsibility to your customer cannot be outsourced. You retain that regardless of what you do with components or parts. We like to say, like inheriting sanity from your kids, you inherit risk from every level of your supply chain. And it's important to recognize that. Okay, so let's look at supply chain visibility. At the first tier, that's your supplier. You have the contract with them, and you can see, according to the terms of your contract, you have visibility into what they're doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what kind of resilience they have. So you own the risk. That makes sense. Now, let's look at the second tier. Well, the second tier is not your supplier. It's your first tier vendor's contract. It's their supplier, and you may or may not have much visibility into what that second tier supplier is doing because it's not your supplier and not your contract. But you still own the risk because if they fail, your supplier at the first tier can't deliver, and it's your problem. At the third tier and beyond, it's obviously not your supplier. It's not your contract. You may not even know that that guy exists, and the visibility is highly questionable. But you still own the risk, and it's important to recognize that. So some anecdotes / case studies. I think most people recall the Japanese tsunami of a couple of years ago in the nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daiichi. That was a major natural disaster which evolved into a major industrial disaster because of damage to the nuclear power plant there in Japan. And that created an incredible number of disruptions. Recall when I was talking about hurricanes, how many different companies are locating along seacoasts and ports? That's exactly what happened in the case of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, located on a coastline along with numerous industries because nuclear power is affordable. And so there were a lot of companies that were in the local area. The tsunami, the earthquake, resultant tsunami, and then the resultant nuclear power plant issues created a huge disruption. One of those disruptions happened to be, just one of them, happened to be in the production of pigments for the paints used in the automotive industry. And as a result, automotive manufacturers throughout the world, Europe, North America, South America, Asia, everybody started to experience problems with being able to paint their cars. And that created a huge response, and a lot of money was thrown at replacing those pigments because it was obvious that it wasn't going to, those plants around the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant weren't going to come back up and start producing pigments next week. So that turned out to have huge impact throughout the world. This next one is a little bit different and certainly highlights the risk, the fact that you inherit risk. Now, we're not going to name the company here because of proprietary information, but a large manufacturer developed a strategy for a new product development, and that strategy entailed outsourcing the development of components. So component A was outsourced for development to company 1, with the understanding that after company 1 developed product A, or subsystem component A, that they would then produce it. And the idea was that this company would be able to outsource or be able to transfer some of the cost of development to other companies. The idea was they could transfer the cost and some of the risk of development. Well, it turned out that there were problems with that. Some of these outsourced components got outsourced. In one case, there was a component that was outsourced to a company in Italy, which then subcontracted to a company in Germany, which then subcontracted to a company in Switzerland, and it wasn't until it started to come apart and they suffered cost overruns and schedule delays and quality issues that the OEM even knew that this Swiss company was involved in it. And it turned out that when the OEM did an assessment of the Swiss company did not have the capabilities necessary to develop that part that was subcontracted 3 levels to them. So huge cost and risk impacts, but the OEM is the one that wound up having problems with the customers. Cost a lot of money. Doesn't mean that the vendors didn't lose money on the development, but it means the OEM still took a hit, and certainly their brand and reputation took a hit.
And it set their program back
quite
a bit, too.
Quite a bit.
They lost
years.
Besides money, they lost a lot of time.
Yep.
So.
Years. Okay, this next one, Nokia and Ericsson, smartphone manufacturers. This one is particularly interesting because we have 2 competing companies side by side who responded differently to a problem. It turns out that Nokia and Ericsson had a common chip provider. So company A provided chips to both Nokia and Ericsson. And the plant that produced those chips experienced a big problem in contamination of their production. So their chips were all of a sudden overnight no good. And it was going to take months to fix the production problem and get back into production. Now, Nokia and Ericsson went to the company that was providing those chips, and the company said, not a problem, we'll be back up in a week to 10 days. Nokia said, not sure I can afford to believe that. Ericsson said, okay, we can wait a week to 10 days. So they responded differently. Nokia began to look for alternate sources for chips. They began to modify their existing designs, accept new chips in there, replace the designs, modified their production line to incorporate the new chips, delivered and continued to sell smartphones. Well, in fact, the chip producer's production line was out for months, and Ericsson wound up sitting there waiting week after week after week. They lost weeks in terms of being able to do the equivalent that Nokia did, and they wound up losing market share. And who did they lose market share to? They lost market share to everybody, but notably to Nokia, because Nokia was still delivering, Ericsson wasn't delivering, and so they lost because Ericsson wasn't prepared to respond to a vendor outage, and Nokia was, and they took the action right away without waiting because they understood that it can take a long time to fix things. So when a supply chain breaks, once again, just emphasizing who suffers. When you don't make a delivery because your vendor didn't supply you, who's your customer going to call? Well, I can guarantee it's not going to be Ghostbusters. Okay, and so what happens? You're going to lose revenue. Your cash flow is going to take a hit. Like the company we talked about with the new product development, your reputation, your brand suffers. You can deliver year after year after year, and when you fail to deliver all of a sudden, people don't remember what you've been delivering for the last 20 years. They remember that you didn't deliver yesterday. Your reputation and your brand can take a big hit overnight. So how do you deal with it? All right, well, like Firestorm says all the time, we predict, we plan, and we perform. What are the vulnerabilities? What do we need to put in place? What are the plans we need to have? How do we make sure they're good and that we know how to execute them? So let's look at those. So the first thing I think that we want to do for this specifically, map your supply chain. Understand not only who your vendors are, but who their vendors are, to the extent that you can work with your vendors and their vendors and their vendors to understand how much visibility you have. You may not be able to get visibility every place because some of those contractual relationships may be proprietary information, they may be competitively sensitive, there may be a number of reasons that you can't develop complete visibility, but at least you know that you don't know something. and that in itself is understanding some of the risk. So map your supply chain, understand the extent of your visibility, and then assess, do I have flexibility in my supply chain, or have I created some brittleness that in itself is a risk for me? So with that understanding of your supply chain, predict your risks. Start with all hazards, and remember, these are not just hazards where you are, but they're hazards where your supply chain links are. So what are the natural disasters that might be a problem? What about geopolitical upheavals? Do we have a sub-tier vendor someplace who's in a politically upheaving area of the globe? Are there financial problems? Everybody right now is looking at what's going on in Europe with respect to the Greek political situation and whether or not Greece might pull out of the European Union Euro system and what that means and what the implications are. So financial failures like that at the geopolitical level, or individual corporate financial failures because of any number of reasons. What about technical issues? So look at all of those hazards, understand how likely are they, and this is important. Why do you think that that's the likelihood? That's important because it makes you do the research, makes you write down why I think that's a probability, high, medium, or low. We're not asking for a probability of 73.865%. Is it a high probability, a medium probability, a low probability? Because that helps you to prioritize where to put your resources in developing a more robust supply chain. If you experience those risks, what's the impact on you? This is if my three suppliers, if one of my three suppliers doesn't deliver, what's the impact? Doesn't make any difference where in the supply chain the failure was. It makes a difference that they didn't deliver to you, and you have to understand what that impact is. And then why do you think that's the impact? Once again, do the research, understand your production line, understand your supply chain. What does it mean if you lose part of that? What's the impact to you? Are you going to reduce production, or are you going to suspend production? If so, for how long, and what can you do about it? Those are the impacts. Important to write them down. So predict that, understand the threats, understand the impacts. That allows you to prioritize. Then, with that prioritization, within the overall context of your supply chain management strategy, you want to make the decisions about sourcing. Do I want to go single source, sole source, multi-source? Am I going to go global? Am I going to go North America? What am I going to do? Make strategic decisions. My experience, and this is even working at Boeing, is that way too many of the outsourcing supply chain decisions are made by someone who is focused on optimizing their particular product, their particular effort, not on looking at it from a corporate standpoint. And so make sure that your sourcing decisions are strategic for your company, and you may decide that we're going to make this decision because that's the best thing for this product, and that's fine. That's made at the corporate level. I'm not saying you need to lump everything together. I'm saying you need to make that decision intentionally at a strategic level. And you need to look at that supply chain from a question of, what about my intellectual property now and the intellectual property that will be critical for me in the future? So the great one, Wayne Gretzky, used to say, the trick is not to skate to where the puck is. The trick is to skate to where the puck is going to be. This is, where is your IP going to be in 5 years? Where's your critical IP going to be in 5 years? What is it? And how do you protect that when you start to make these critical decisions? Because you don't want to create a supply chain that holds you hostage in your efforts to make a supply chain that's lean and resilient. So then, what's your criteria in your vendors for eliminating risk or avoiding it, mitigating it, transferring it, that's resilience talk for insurance, or accepting the risk? Firestorm worked with a major electronics manufacturer, and we went through the mapping of their supply chain and identified 256 risks that were unknown at the time we started the mapping exercise with them. Now, it's important to recognize that as we got down to this step of eliminating, avoiding, mitigating, or transferring, we were able to reduce that 256 to about 12 risks that they had to accept and then mitigate or transfer. 12 out of that 256. So just because there's a substantial number of risks doesn't mean that you're going to have to do a great deal of mitigation or accepting of risk. There are other decisions you can make that will eliminate or avoid those. And in this particular case, the vast majority of them were able to be dealt with pretty easily and at a pretty low cost, which is eliminating the waste of putting together plans you don't really need. So then, with that in place, you now understand, well, what do I want to say to my critical suppliers? How do I want to incorporate business continuity as part of my relationship with these suppliers? I can put into my contract that I mandate that they do business continuity planning, or that they provide me with a guarantee of resilience and the ability to deliver in the face of a disruption. Or I can include in my vendor selection criteria business continuity and resilience. Those are things that you can do, and as you start to look at your individual vendors, there are other options that can be included in establishing those relationships. And once again, it's building trust and understanding that. So it's important to be able to do that. Once you have that in place, those criteria and those understandings, you can then develop actionable plans for reacting to and recovering from any of the risks that you have intentionally accepted or that you have mitigated, but understanding that you haven't eliminated. You can put those plans together. And I want to emphasize once again, actionable, because a plan that is just a goal then defers until there's a crisis coming up with what the actual actions are. And in a crisis is the wrong time to start thinking about what you need to do to manage the crisis, recover from it, get back to operations. It's much, much better and more effective to do that before. That's the whole idea of planning.
Okay, and Guy, I'm gonna like loop back around for just a minute to the segmenting your supply chain. The reason you segment your supply chain and understand which of your vendors are more critical than others helps you as you establish your plans for recovering from loss of any of those vendors. Obviously, commodity vendors, you know, you need somewhat of a plan in place. You need to know who else you're going to go to if you lose that particular vendor. But the critical vendors, you need much more complex plans and understanding of those vendors and how to mitigate losing those vendors.
So I'm gonna tell a little bit of a story here. I'm going to tell, but not much of one. Okay, so a big company, Alcoa Aluminum. Alcoa is a supplier. Okay, their product is aluminum in various shapes, alloys, etc. They have gone to their customers and identified their Alcoa's criticality, and for critical deliveries to customers, Alcoa has developed alternative production capabilities globally. So they've reached out there, once again, to build trust with their customers that they can deliver in any kind of a situation because they've invested. For small companies, medium-sized companies, that's not possible. But that's just an example of the extent to which a company like Alcoa believes in resiliency. So with those actionable plans in place, let's make sure that we train the people who are going to be taking those actions, the ones that are involved in responding to a break in the supply chain. They have to understand the plans, be comfortable with them, and the best way to do that is to involve them in the developing of those plans. With those plans in hand and your people trained, you can test the plans and find out how well they work. That doesn't mean shutting down your production. It means going through a tabletop exercise as extensive as you need to make it. Test your plans, learn from them, then conduct exercises. Specifically, conduct unannounced exercises. You know, grab the people someday and surprise them with a, by the way, vendor A is just suspended, this is a drill, has just suspended operations for a month, what are we going to do? Scenario-based, learn from it, incorporate the learning into the plans, and internalize it so that you can respond quickly, effectively, and efficiently, which is lean. So, it's all about predicting, planning, and performing, and that means taking that learning out of the perform part and feeding it back into the prediction, making sure that you're involved in continuous improvement in your resiliency processes. So, is your supply chain dangerously lean? The disruptions happen every single day. 70,000 natural disasters, not including the man-made ones, and it doesn't have to happen in your neighborhood to shut you down. And the bigger and more specialized your supply chain, the more likely it is that there's going to be a disruption that is going to have an impact on your operations. You can prepare to mitigate any of those disruptions that you experience. And if you do that, then one weak link in your chain won't make you a victim, because you will have created a resilient and lean supply chain. It's all about predict, plan, and perform. So with that, I think we're down to the questions. Do we have any questions?
Bill, are you there?
Yeah, had to get off my mute button. We do not have any questions yet.
Okay.
Okay, well, if any of you... But if any of you have questions, you know, after the fact, don't hesitate to get in touch with Amanda or with us, and we'll get you answers. So let's go. So, Amanda,
you wanted to speak to this.
Yes. Thank you guys for talking about lean the way you did today. It does have the pros and cons that you mentioned, and it's all about how you implement it. So Manufacturing Works, we've taken a lot from lean and also from processes where you can incorporate innovation, and we've developed a training class called Efficiency Through Innovation. It's one day, it's interactive, and we put it on by request with companies in Wyoming. So if you're interested in this, let me know. It is a class that qualifies for the Workforce Training Grant. And even if you don't have a company that's big enough to have one training on site for just you, still let me know, and I'll keep you in the loop as maybe there's a few other companies who are interested, and a lot of time we wind up doing the class for a group of companies.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. The next webinar, sponsored by Manufacturing Works and presented by Firestorm, will be Surviving Any Disruption to Your Business. It's next February 10th at 11. You can register at the manufacturingworks.com website. We do not have a date for this yet, but we also have an upcoming all-day workshop that's called Preparedness and Resiliency, Surviving Disruption. Taking steps will help you start taking the first steps to making your company disaster ready. Learn how you can protect your people, your facilities, your intellectual property, and gain a competitive advantage through preparedness. Understand just how prepared your company is.
So that workshop includes, that last bullet there, that workshop includes an assessment of your company. That assessment as a standalone offering by Firestorm typically would cost a client about $2,500, and it's included in the much smaller cost of the workshop in conjunction with our partnership with Manufacturing Works.
And it assesses the degree of readiness in your company.
And you get a written report from that.
So, if there haven't been any other questions, are there any other questions, Bill?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you again, Guy and Jennifer, both for sharing your expertise today. You have a lot of experience with looking at these plans, and we really appreciate that you're bringing your experience to Wyoming.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We enjoy doing it, and we're happy to give you 10 minutes of your life back. Thank you for joining us.
Don't spend it all in one place.
Thank you for joining us today. Bye, all.
Okay.